tonight's lecture series aims to simplify some very difficult concepts. I'm going to try to get these concepts, which are very important, and present them to you as simply as I can, so that they can be accessible to all persons. And in doing so, if I simplify these difficult concepts, there's always a risk of caricature, of caricaturing the actual content, and missing out on the deeper meaning of each of the topics that we address here in this class during this time. So in order to do that, if I do say something and a question pops up in your mind, or you have some further comment or something that you want to do, just remember that at the end of each of the lectures, there's going to be a Q&A session. So just to help address the issues that may arise from the lecture. So since we're recording the lecture series also for our podcasts, we're going to put it up on our Apple Podcast. And by the way, our Apple Podcast is doing fantastic. We get quite a few listens every week. We have about 80 to 100 listens a week. And that's fantastic for a podcast. Anyway, we're recording this so that we can put it up on our Apple iTunes podcast. And please make sure then that if you do have a question, I have a microphone set up over here that you kindly speak your question into the microphone. That'll help for the recording of the podcast. I also ask that you kindly refrain from interrupting the lecture. If you do have a question, just refrain, jot it down or something, and then wait for the Q&A session so that at that time you can ask your question or make your comment. Please keep the comments brief and to the point. Sessions for the Christ and Culture Lecture Series, a total of 8 lectures every Sunday for 2 months then. We'll end on July 29th, which is the last Sunday of July, so that will be a total of 8 Sundays. And today's session is the introduction to the series. So we're just going to go over introductory material about Christ and culture so you can get a grasp of what we're talking about. Some of you might be a little mystified. What's going on here? You're not quite sure. And then session 2, there are 5 different typologies that Richard Niebuhr presents in his book. So the next 5 sessions after that will be dealing with each one of those different typologies. And you can see them listed here. Christ against culture, Christ of culture. And then we have the median types, which are Christ above culture, Christ and culture and paradox, and Christ transforming culture. Don't worry if you don't understand what's going on right now. It'll become very clear and evident to you as we progress through this. And then session 7 will be a postscript where we'll ask the big question, does culture indeed matter? Does it matter, especially for religious people? Or is this something that really, it's superficial and we're escaping it to go to a better place, as many Christians have thought about in the past? So we'll address that question in session 7, and then session 8 will be a concluding postscript about the Christ and Culture series. Any questions on that? Good. And then teacher, of course, it's me. Hooray. My name is James. My Korean name is Young, so I generally tend to put them together as James Young C. Kim. You got my email address and my phone over here. I would invite you at any time to, if you have any questions or you want some follow-up on something, please contact me. I love it. I love it when I can interact and have dialogue with all of you and go through those kinds of things. The recommended reading list is down over here. There are 3 books, but 2 of them are written in response to what Richard Niebuhr wrote. So the first book is, of course, Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture, which was originally written in 1951. I do have the second edition of 2001, which is the 50th anniversary edition. Incidentally, I have both of them over here because Sherry was kind enough to bring her own copy, and this is the original 1951 edition, as well as the 2001 edition. So I'll just pass these around for you to peruse. Take a look at them. And then a couple of other books, one by Craig Carter called Rethinking, Christ and Culture, a post-Christendom perspective. This was written in 2006. And of course, it's because this book was a seminal book. It made a huge influence among people who study theology. And so there were a couple of books written in response to that. One from a post-Christendom perspective by Craig Carter, and then the other one from a more evangelical perspective written by D.A. Carson is Christ and Culture, Revisited, which was written in 2008. So those are the recommended books for reading, but as I said earlier, you don't have to read any of the books. We're just going to try to simplify the concepts over here in the class so that everybody can be aware of the topics. If you do have questions, I just ask that you would refrain from asking the questions until the end of the lecture. We'll have a Q&A session at that time. And if you do have a question during the lecture, you can just jot it down or put it somewhere. We have a little microphone. I would ask you to ask a question through the microphone because we're recording this for our podcast. And that would be very, very helpful. Can you all see okay over here? Awesome. Oh, okay. Well, a little bit about myself. My name is James Young Kim. I did my Master's of Theology at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is in Pasadena, California. Incidentally, I heard that they're relocating their campus. So they're actually in about 3 to 5 years, they're relocating to a different part of Los Angeles. But they've been in Pasadena ever since its inception. And it's a fantastic school, highly, highly intellectual, to the point where the students there jokingly say it should actually be called Fuller the Logical Seminary. And that's the joke that we share around. Well, after Fuller, I did my Master's of Theology there. I did a postgraduate in Literature and Theology, Scripture and Theology at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, which was fantastic. Studied under N.T. Wright, who was basically the main reason why I wanted to do postgraduate studies at St. Andrews, because he was teaching there. And he is, to me, the theologian for the 21st century, biblical, let's say early biblical scholar, New Testament and early Christianity. He's a scholar for that kind of field, and it was fantastic to study over there for a couple of years. Personally, a little bit about me personally, I grew up in Uganda. Although I was born in South Korea, I was only about a month old when my family moved to Uganda, Africa. So that's where I grew up. I spent the first 8 years of my life there. My dad was a medical missionary. And then I spent my teenage years, about 10 years, from about 8 years old till 18 years, almost 18. Right around that time I spent in Brazil, so before I finally did come to the United States. I'm also the founder of Synergy Church, which I guess you all know about. We've been around, this is our third year now, so it's been about 2.5 years. Our founding date, our first Sunday that we had service together actually was November 1st, 2015. So we're coming up into our third anniversary, which will be November 1st in 2018, right? So that date for me is very easy to remember because I always think of it as November 1st, 111. So you can just remember that quite easily. Now, I did also want to talk a little bit about Richard Niebuhr, because this is what the class is about. He's the guy who wrote this book that has become so seminal and so important for theological studies. Richard Niebuhr is a Christian ethicist, and he is actually considered one of the most important Christian ethicists in the 20th century. He got his PhD at Yale and then taught at a different school and then ended up back at Yale as a professor, I think for like some 30 years of Christian ethics at the divinity school at Yale. He's incredibly, incredibly brilliant man. But you probably know more about his brother, Reinhold. Reinhold Niebuhr, his older brother, was a pastor and a theologian and a scholar also. But he's the guy who authored the Serenity Prayer. You all remember the Serenity Prayer, the one that says, Lord, help me to what? Accept the things I cannot change. Yes, that's Reinhold Niebuhr. He wrote the Serenity Prayer, so most people know him more for that. Richard was the Christian ethicist, the younger brother, and Niebuhr was concerned throughout his life with the absolute sovereignty of God and the issue of historical relativism. How can there be a God who is absolutely sovereign and there exists so much evil and wickedness and trouble and hardship in the world? That's the main big question of Christian ethics, right? So that was his main preoccupation. And from there, as we already mentioned, came this book, Christ and Culture, which is his most important and famous book. In this book, Niebuhr gives a history of how Christianity has responded to culture. How Christianity has responded to culture. Journal of Religion, in the back of the book, says this: without any doubt, the one outstanding book in the field of basic Christian social ethics. So this is high praise for this book, and it's well-deserved praise also. You will find, of course, a whole lot of criticism of the book, but the reason why people criticize the book is because it is the standard, right? From which everybody else has to derive their sources from. It's almost like G.F. Hegel. Hegel with his system of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, that huge philosophical framework that he brought up in the 19th century, so that all of modern philosophy has been basically a response to Hegel. So in many ways, Christian ethics has been a response to Niebuhr, likewise in the same manner, and this book that he wrote called Christ and Culture. Now the book begins with a chapter called The Enduring Problem. The enduring problem. And the problem is simply stated is just this: how do you live in the world as a Christian? How do you live in the world as a Christian? Hold that question in your mind, and we'll look at the background for this book. Published in 1951, so we're talking about in the 1940s. Historically, what was going on in the 1940s? Of course, we know World War II, the end of World War II. Right around that time, there was Nazism, fascism, the Holocaust, World War II, and then the rise of Marxism in half of the globe. All of these important historical events were going on all over the place. Some of them were tragic. There were a lot of atrocities that were going on all over the world. And so in this period of time, in the 1940s, a lot of secular intellectuals were very highly critical of Christianity and its role in history. And the basic criticism was this, that all of these atrocities that were going on in Europe, which is basically a Christendom, a nation that was heavily influenced by Christianity, well, a continent that was heavily influenced by Christianity, why is it that all these atrocities occurred in that place? And why did Christians not do anything about it? Why were they incapable of influencing the culture in a good and positive way that would have prevented such atrocities as the Holocaust, or the mass murder of a whole bunch of different kinds of people, Jews, genocide, World War II, the atomic bomb, and now the threat of Marxism rising up all over the place. So this was a very, very confused time. No doubt some of you in this room have lived through that. I didn't, of course, right? I was a little bit younger than that, but some of you understand the time frame much, much better than I could, because it was part of your history, part of your time. So this was the criticism that was going on. It was very anti-Christian, the secular intellectual culture, criticizing Christianity for not having stepped up and done something to prevent the great chaos at the end of modernity and heading now into post-modernity. You see, modernity was a very intellectual time. It was a very positive time when human society thought that they could actually create some kind of a utopia in this world with progress and evolution. And so, Thomas More's utopia, Enlightenment period going into modernity was very positive about what human beings could achieve. But then what happened? World War I, World War II, genocide, craziness, the discovery that we could actually destroy this entire planet with the technology that we had gotten, with atomic bomb and nuclear bomb and all of this kind of stuff. So the general optimism of the modernity was now replaced by a great skepticism in the postmodern period. And when the postmodern scholars looked back at modernity, they were highly critical of Christianity, because Europe was basically Christian, and Christianity was unable to prevent these kinds of disasters from happening. Now, what Niebuhr does is he looks at this question, he looks at the criticism, and he doesn't criticize back. Rather, he takes it at face value. But he goes on to claim that this criticism is not something new. It's existed from its very inception, this enduring problem, how to live in the world as a Christian, from the very earliest Christian communities in the first century. So it wasn't just about the 20th century. We Christians have had this struggle from the very, very beginning. That's why he calls it the enduring problem. So don't just criticize it for this time. You might as well go ahead and criticize it from its very beginning. Christianity has had this problem. It's not a new question, but a perennial problem that endures from the very inception of the religion. Actually, Niebuhr will go on to say it began with Jesus himself, the founder of this new religion. Because if you look at the Gospels, when Jesus was perceived by the culture of his time, which was what? Judaism, Israel, Jesus was perceived as a threat to his culture. To the point where, what did they do? They crucified him. They killed him off. He would say such radical things as, "My kingdom is not of this world." And so the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Israelites perceived Jesus as a threat to their way of life, to their culture. And this goes back all the way to the very beginning with the founder of this religion himself. It's an enduring problem that has gone on from century to century to century without a real solution to it. We're just stuck in this, and we need to recognize that. That's how Niebuhr begins the book. Because this question is complicated. It's many-sided. It's incredibly difficult. It's unresolved. There's always going to be this tension between how a Christian lives in light of the principles that Jesus teaches in the secular world, in the culture at large. And the different Christian communities have to always wrestle and struggle with that question. So the way the New York Times Book Review puts it, in what way is Christ relevant to the situation in which the Christian must live? In what way is Jesus relevant to you as his follower in your life, in your present life here on this earth? Or is it only about the future life? Is it only about escaping this world and going to heaven? Because that is one of the ways that certain Christians, the escapist type Christians, have answered the question, the enduring problem, you see. So this is a problem. This is something, you see this all the time. You and me, we as Christians, well, those who in the room who are Christians, how do you as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, live your life in the secular world? That's the question Niebuhr was addressing. And so from his book, we mentioned that he started off by saying it's not just a 20th century problem. This is something that has been occurring from the very, very beginning of Christianity. In fact, from its very founder, Jesus. And so page 4 of his introductory chapter about the enduring problem, he says this: not all the Jews of his day, the day of Jesus in the first century, well, not all of the Jews rejected Jesus. The majority of the Jews perceived him as a threat to Judaism, but not all of them rejected Jesus in the name of their culture. And 2,000 years of non-Jewish Christianity and non-Christian Judaism may be appealed to in validation of many other propositions than that Jesus imperils culture. Because that was the perception of Jesus back in the first century by his own culture, by his own tribe, let's put it that way. He was a threat. He imperils our culture. But it is evident that these 2 millennia have been full of wrestling with just this problem. This is an enduring problem. And then Niebuhr goes on to give a very insightful comment here. Not only Jews, but also Greeks and Romans, medievalists, moderns, Westerners, Orientals have rejected Christ because they see him as a threat to their culture. Have you ever experienced that yourself? You know, like when you go out and you talk to somebody who might be a non-Christian and you share the news, the gospel with a non-Christian or somebody like that, oftentimes, sometimes, especially if they come from a culture which is very, very different from yours, they might actually see that as a threat. I think about my Muslim friends. You know, when I was in St. Andrews in Scotland, my Muslim roommate, and we had many enlightening theological conversations. These were wonderful conversations we had together. And yet, at the same time, I could perceive that for him, it would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to convert to Christianity. Why? Because it would mean he has to abandon his culture entirely. That's why, you see, Jesus can be perceived as a threat to culture throughout history, in many, many different cultures. Why did Christianity take a foothold in Korea, but it didn't take a foothold in Japan? Whereas Western civilization, Christendom, had sent missionary upon missionary upon mission countless times to Japan to try to evangelize and preach the good news of Jesus to Japan. It didn't take a foothold in Japan, it did in Korea. That's a very interesting question to ponder, right? Part of the reason why is because Japan has had a very high culture with their gods and goddesses, a worldview that's already fully established and well made, and they perceived Christianity, these Jesuit missionaries were coming in and other missionaries coming in, as a threat to their culture. You see that? What didn't happen in Korea? Well, it's a very, very complicated thing, but part of the reason why I think is because Korea was one of those tiny little nations which was constantly under threat by other huge superpowers, Japan and China. Korea is right in the middle of that. So they were constantly being invaded and constantly being threatened. So their culture was more like that. I don't know what's the proper word to say it, but so that when Christianity came in, they really didn't have a sense of we need to defend ourselves against this. Well, maybe some parts of Korea did, but for the common folk in Korea, they didn't have that kind of a sense. And so it was much more easily accepted in Korea than it was in Japan. So that's just one of the things you see where Christianity can be rejected on account of it being perceived as a threat to culture. Just this week, what did we have? We had a Supreme Court decision. I've been following this case with a lot of fascination. I've had some conversations with some of you already about this. You remember the Christian baker in Colorado who a gay couple had come and requested he make a custom cake for them. But he refused on what? On religious grounds, on the principle that he has certain ethical, moral boundaries in his worldview, in his religious worldview, which don't square with the culture at large. And so there's this tension, this enduring problem. Do you, as a Christian, accede to that demand and go ahead and bake the cake, or do you not? That's the tension we're talking about between Christ and culture. The state of Colorado decided he did not have that right. And so they charged him with an offense, a civil rights violation. And this went all the way up to the Supreme Court and got decided just this week when it came down, the ruling came down, in which they vindicated the Christian baker. They allowed his religious rights to stand in this particular case. They didn't make it a, all-encompassing case. But they allowed it in this particular case that he could stand on religious grounds and say no to this couple. They don't want it to become an exemplar for the rest of it because it could lead to some very, very terrible other places, right? And then here's the thing. This is why it's an enduring problem. Not all Christians agree with this baker. Have you noticed that? Some say, he did the right thing. And others go, I would have just baked the cake. What's the big deal about that, right? So that's why it's this unresolved, complicated, enduring problem. How do you, as a Christian, live in the world? Yes. Okay. Hold that thought. Can you hold that thought until the end of the lecture and we'll address that at that point? Very good question. Very, very good question. But we need to hold up that and just go through it, and then we'll address those kinds of questions at the end. So you see why this is a problem. How do you, as somebody who is a follower of this Jesus, who was perceived, and the word perceived is important, who was perceived as a threat to culture, how do you then, as a Christian, live in the culture? Right? That's the question that Niebuhr addresses in his book, and which is very instructive and informative for you and me today. And that's why that book became a classic, became such a seminal book in theology. So Niebuhr goes on to point out 3 different kinds of perceptions of threat that occurred with Christianity and the world, and that occurred from its very beginning. Because the critics in the 1940s were talking about World War II, Nazism, fascism, Marxism, all the isms of that period of time. Nietzsche took it all the way back to the first century and said this has been an enduring problem from the very beginning. And these are 3 of the criticisms of Christianity throughout its history. First of all, prominent among these recurrent arguments against Christianity is a contention that is Gibbon. You know, Gibbon is the guy who wrote that History of the Roman Empire. Gibbon states the Roman case, Christians are animated by a contempt for present existence. They actually are contemptuous for the present life and by confidence in immortality. So the first criticism was that they really don't care about this world. They keep talking and yapping on and on about the world that is to come. In fact, isn't that what Jesus preached? The kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of heaven. That was his message, right? So how are they going to participate in our project of creating a utopia, an advanced civilization, if they have contempt for this world and they only care about the world that's to come? That's the first major criticism, right? I mean, Roman civilization, they were the height of civilization back in Jesus' day. And Christians are not participating in this program to create modernity, to create good things, wonderful, because they have a contempt for this world and look to the world that is to come. Never mind that this is a bit of a caricature, because if you truly go into Christian theology, it's not about a contempt for this world, as we have seen over and over again. We'll go into that a little bit later. Okay? So this, to me, is a bit of a caricature, but it still is the critique of a lot of Christian communities from the very beginning, that they don't care about civilization. They don't care about the arts and music and television and movies. In fact, they burn that stuff, right? They're motivated by a contempt for the advancement of human civilization because they believe in some kind of afterlife that is to come, which is more important than this life. Criticism number 1. Criticism number 2. Another common argument raised against Christ by his cultural antagonists of various times and persuasions, this is not just about 20th century, this is from all time, is that he induces men to rely on the grace of God. Christianity is about grace instead of summoning them to human achievement. Not works, but grace. You've heard that countless times in your Christian life, haven't you? That we live by what? By what? By grace and not by works. Whereas this world is trying to build civilization. They're trying to build culture, modernity, make things so that everybody can live a comfortable and good life right here and right now. So that's the criticism. We don't do the work, Christians. We rely on grace, a free gift. And we are opposed to human work, human achievement. So we don't participate in the modern culture in creating these things. Criticism number 2. Third criticism, a third count in the recurring cultural indictments of Christ and His church is that they are intolerant. Haven't you heard that? Christians are not tolerant people. They are intolerant of others. You hear that constantly all the time. So this is the third criticism. And it's very informative the way that Niebuhr puts it here, so I'm just going to read it a little bit. Ancient Roman civilization, says Gibbon, was bound to do what? To reject Christianity, to reject the claims of Christ, just because Rome was tolerant. The virtue of the Roman Empire was tolerance. Sure, they went and conquered all of these other people groups and nations and things, but they tolerated their beliefs, their worldviews. So you Egyptians, we've conquered you, but you can continue on with your religious practices. You Jews, we conquered you, but you can continue on with your monotheism. We tolerate every culture's, groups, worldviews, civilizations. So the Roman principle that actually allowed them to flourish in the world was tolerance. Think about it. Romans were a very polytheistic, paganism just basically means that they had this pantheon of gods and goddesses that were not Roman, by the way, but that they had incorporated from other civilizations that they had conquered. They just renamed them or did something else, like the Greek gods and goddesses were just renamed in Roman civilization, and they just incorporated things from different cultures because they tolerated every culture. This culture, with its great diversity, isn't this a good virtue to have? Tolerance, right? We even think that way. We think Romanly in today's world. With its great diversity of customs and religions, could exist only. This kind of thing can only exist if reverence and assent were granted to the many confused traditions and ceremonies of its constituent nations. So what if they're all inconsistent? That doesn't matter to us. We'll just tolerate everybody's beliefs. That's Rome. And that's part of our Western heritage. That's why tolerance is such a great big virtue in the 21st century today. But, hence, it was to be expected then that they would unite with indignation against any sect of people which should separate itself from the communion of mankind, and claiming the exclusive possession of divine knowledge should disdain every form of worship except its own as impious and idolatrous. That was Christianity. Christianity was radically monotheistic. There's only one God. We don't accept your Roman pantheon of gods and goddesses. We don't participate in emperor worship. This might sound a little superficial to us, but in the first century, this was a matter of life and death. If you did not participate in the Roman culture, you see, Roman tolerance, quote unquote, is one thing. They will tolerate you so long as you accept their practices. But the moment you stop accepting their practices, they can be very intolerant. In fact, they will crucify you. Right? So be careful of people who preach tolerance. Be wise about that kind of preaching, right? So here's this sect of people who are radically monotheists and will therefore not accept the things of the culture at large, the pantheon of gods, emperor worship, and all of those kind of things which Romans look at as the virtue of tolerance. Therefore, these Christians, with their radical monotheism, are considered intolerant. And they were persecuted for the first 4 centuries of Christianity. It was just persecution upon persecution because of this enduring problem. How do I, as a Christian, live in the culture at large? Got that? Those are our three objections to Christianity, then. It kind of brought me to think about something that happened on our Facebook ad. You know, we have been advertising this lecture series on Facebook, and we put it up over there and spent some money on Facebook to post the ad in our local community so that the people in the area who are on Facebook, they would see the ad and hopefully come to this lecture. And so we had a couple of comments on the ad which were pretty interesting. I blanked out the names because it's not about calling out anybody. But of course we get a comment about, looking forward to it. This is going to be great, I'm sure. Everything Pastor Kim has taught has been informative, inspiring, highly enlightening. Make time for this one. I know who put that comment. Thank you. Great, I feel good. It made me feel really good. But then the next comment right after that comes from somebody who says this: is this a religion that believes all are children of God and welcome? See, this is a question of tolerance coming up, right? Do you tolerate everybody here? Is this a religion that believes all are children of God and welcome? Post your mission statement for all to read and know what you truly teach. So this person is highly antagonistic already to this idea of learning about Christ and culture, to learning this thing. And I look at that and I go, whoa, she's actually demanding now. She's taking the posture of telling you what to do, hijacking our ad with her own personal agenda. I'm going, who is this person anyway? So I look at her personal profile, and the intro to her profile says, I am a person with a deep passion for equality, diversity, and education for all. Love people, love life. And then, of course, right down there it says married to, and I blanked out the name, but it's a woman also. So right away I know that we're talking about somebody who her inclusiveness is something that is perceived from a Christian perspective as being highly intolerant. And she might actually be justified with that. Maybe she's had some church experiences where she's gone to church and they have been highly intolerant of her lifestyle. Right? So how do we deal with this problem? This is the enduring problem. And we got it right here as an example for this particular class. How do I, as a follower of Christ now, interact or engage with this person? And it's a difficult, complicated, hard question, an enduring problem if you're going to be honest. You ain't going to solve this easily. But so I look at her profile and I look at the things that she's posted on her profile, and guess what I find? There's a lot of anger there. I find post after post after post which is highly critical of certain people. In fact, this is her profile photo. Kakistocracy, government by the worst persons, a form of government in which the worst persons are in power. She has all these pictures of politicians from a particular group in the political spectrum. One of the things I love about our church, because our principle is synergistic, right? Synergy. One of the things I love about it is we have people from different perspectives, and we need to honor and respect that. But so I ask myself the question, since I see these posts constantly damning other people who don't particularly agree with her worldview, is go back to the question. Is this a religion that believes all are children of God and welcome? And I wonder to myself, does she perceive her own inconsistency? Because she's damning an entire group of people, the ones who don't agree with her. And yet she's claiming to be all tolerant at the same time. How can you do that? Right? So, and then the big demand, post your mission statement. I'm telling you what to do. And so the thing that I decided to do, how do I interact with this? How do I do this? This enduring problem I've got to deal with. And I've had to deal with it in many other occasions here and there. Sometimes I've dealt with it badly, sometimes wisely. Because this is problematic, it's complex, it's difficult. So I chose not to reply. And that, by the way, is an option. But I have another option also on Facebook, because this is our ad. I have the option to delete the post and ban the user from our group, which incidentally, in previous posts in the past from our church and so forth on Facebook, I have very rarely done something like that, removed a post because it was so wickedly evil, right? But I chose not to do that either. I've made 2 informed choices already about this enduring problem. And the reason why is because this is a great example for us of the enduring problem. This is what we have to deal with as followers of Christ over and over and over again, living in this culture. And the question is, how are you going to do it? And Niebuhr's genius of it is this: there's no one answer. In fact, the only way I can really put it out there, says Niebuhr, is to give you 5 typologies of ways that Christian communities throughout history, from its very foundation, 2,000 years of Christian history, have attempted to answer this enduring problem. You see why this book is so informative and so good? So, just before we proceed, since we looked at this one example, I want to talk a little bit about something which is crucial for learning, and I call it epistemic humility. And epistemic humility is very basic. It's the key to learning. If you don't have epistemic humility, there ain't nothing you ain't gonna learn a thing. You'll go in one ear and go right out the other. It's like having a cup that's completely full to the brim, and somebody tries to pour something in, it ain't gonna go in, right? Because it's full. So you need to have epistemic humility. Episteme is what? Mind, psyche, brain, your rational process. That process needs to be well aware of its limitations, that you don't have full, complete knowledge, and therefore you are subject to making errors all the time, and you need to think deeply and carefully about all of these things before you come to any sort of a judgment about them. So epistemic humility means non-judgmental in the beginning. I'll put it that way. Because you do ultimately have to make judgments. Every human being does who lives in this world. But here's the key. You remain non-judgmental until you can glean as much information as you can. And then you make an informed judgment. That's what epistemic humility basically means. It doesn't mean being non-judgmental for the rest of your life, because you would be a fool if you were to be that way. You have to participate, you have to make decisions, you have to employ your brain, your reason, your rationality. But epistemic humility means gathering that information in an open and objective, as much as possible objective manner as you possibly can, in order to make a good informed judgment at the end. It's like our law courts do. You're presumed innocent until what? You guys all said proven guilty. Speaks volumes about what we think about our justice system, right? But that's what it is. It's this process where you're going to present evidence through a period of time, and then weigh and counterweigh the evidence as a peer jurist, right? A jury of your peers. Weigh that very carefully, and only at the end do you make that judgment. And so as we go through this process, there's weeks of looking at the different typologies that Niebuhr makes, I'm just going to simply ask you to withhold your judgment. Just soak in information. That's what we're doing. And then towards the end, when you've gathered as much information as you possibly can, then you can choose which one of those typologies you prefer. Got it? Good. In order for us to go through with all this, we need to define what Christ is and what culture is. Because that's the title of the book, Christ and Culture. So towards a definition of Christ and towards a definition of culture. Because we're not going to be able to get this full clarity, 100% definition of either one of these, but we can get a good picture, a good enough picture of each one of these particular things, as Niebuhr has put it. And so right away from the very beginning, in defining Christ, Niebuhr makes a distinction between the person of Jesus himself and his communities, Christianity, which is you and us. Okay? There's a distinction between the person, the historical figure in the first century, Jesus of Nazareth, and the communities that have come along of his followers through the centuries. And because there are various communities of Jesus Christ, the next thing we point out is that there are different ways to address the culture from different Christian communities. So the Catholics, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists will approach this enduring problem from different angles, and you'll get different answers to this question. That, nevertheless, doesn't mean that there are many different Christs. There's only one Christ. The New Testament figure who was crucified and raised from the dead, the one whom Christians accept as their authority. So it's a little bit of a complex picture. The thing is that each one of the different Christian communities or denominations or groups does not have complete and exclusive access to the one Christ. And so we try to the very best of our ability with the information that we have to derive an answer to the enduring problem, but it can be very different for different communities of Christians. There's only one Christ, though. Just because our answers differ does not mean there are many different Christs. So what is culture then? Christ and culture. Well, here's a dictionary definition of what culture is. Culture is the arts and other manifestations of human achievement regarded collectively. So it's all of the things that humans have achieved throughout history collectively, all taken together. For example, 20th century popular culture, right? And the things that humans have achieved can comprise things such as ideas, customs, social behavior of a particular people or society. Afro-Caribbean culture, they behave a certain way. They're a certain culture, as opposed to, let's say, Korean culture or Native American culture. Various different kinds of cultures in the plural out there. So, but the totality is what we're thinking about here. Not these individual small little things, but the totality of human culture is what we'll be thinking about. Now, the word itself comes from a Latin word, culturare, which is a farming metaphor. You culture the land, right? For those of you who have been farmers in the past, you treat the land, you culture the land in order to grow and produce crops. And so that farming metaphor became incorporated as an analogy to cultivation of the mind, cultivation of the soul, cultivation of the human psyche, and all of those kinds of things in order to produce a human culture. This is Niebuhr's definition of culture, and it's extremely important. So let's just take a look at this a little bit. Niebuhr says, what we have in view when we deal with Christ and culture is that total process. Sorry about that. Let me get back a bit. Yeah, he says that total process of human activity. The word total is key here. Niebuhr isn't talking about Afro-Caribbean culture, Chinese culture. He has in mind the whole thing. In other words, he's pulling back from the forest. Instead of looking at the trees, the individual trees, he wants to see the entire forest of it. So it's a big picture idea that he's talking about. So the total process of human activity and that total result of such activity to which we now give the name culture. Now the name civilization, total human civilization, not American civilization, British civilization, but the total process of it is applied in common speech. Now the name civilization, which is applied in common speech. And he goes on to say this. This is the definition, and this is key. Please pay attention to this part. Culture, Niebuhr's definition, is the artificial, secondary environment which man superimposes on the natural. Let me repeat that. Culture is the artificial, secondary, not primary, secondary environment which man superimposes upon the primary environment, which is nature. And what does culture comprise of? Language, habits, ideas, beliefs, customs, social organization, inherent artifacts, technical processes, values, education, music, movies. All of this stuff is culture. But it is artificial and secondary. Think about it this way. Imagine Adam and Eve, they were created the first day on earth, and they're put in this Garden of Eden, and God doesn't just put them there to do nothing. He actually gives them a job. Tend this garden. Do work. Work is important. Do something with it. We were talking about that when we were at Debbie Patterson's house the other day, planting stuff. This is what God originally intended Adam and Eve to do, to cultivate the land, right? So here's Adam and Eve, and they've been created, and hooray, this is a beautiful place. I love it. My job is great. Awesome. Tending the stuff. And then nighttime comes, and here's Eve, because she's a woman, going, Adam, what are we going to do about sleeping? And he goes, let me think about this for a little while. And he breaks down a bunch of twigs and leaves and stuff, and then he puts it on the ground and creates a rough bed. He goes, here, Eve, what do you think of this? Could we sleep on this? Hey, that's cool. You know what Adam has done? He's taken the primary environment, nature, and created an artificial secondary environment, the bed, made out of twigs and leaves and stuff. Now they can keep warm at night and huddle together and sleep. That's what culture is. That's primitive culture, but guess what? It is out of those things that we get everything else. All of this stuff you see around us is an artificial, secondary environment. And what's the primary environment? It's nature. Well, the way that I've explained it to kids as simply as I possibly can is, it's as if God created a bunch of Legos and said, here, create. That's the primary environment, and then he gives us the materials to create the secondary environment over it. And that's how we get civilization. That's how we get culture. That's Niebuhr's definition. And it's an extremely insightful one because it's all-encompassing. It's pulled back from the minutest details of the trees to see the entire forest of culture. So man superimposes the secondary environment over the natural by language, habits, ideas, beliefs, customs, social organization, politics, inherited artifacts. Inherited because when you produce something, it keeps getting produced over and over and over again. Whoever invented the wheel, that's a cultural environment that has made a huge and tremendous impact on all of us. Fred Flintstone doesn't have to have that little car and run with his legs, right? So technical processes, values, all of these kinds of things are what comprise culture. That's the definition of culture that Niebuhr came up with, which is brilliant. Then after that, I want to take a look at the biblical text itself from the very opening chapter of the Bible in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, because theologians commonly refer to this verse as the cultural mandate. God actually mandating Adam and Eve to go create something out of the Lego pieces that I gave you. It's called the cultural mandate. And incidentally, what's the first commandment in the Bible? When I ask that question, people think the Ten Commandments. No, I'm talking about the first commandment that God gives to human beings in the Bible is this. God blessed them and God said to them, be fruitful. So go and have sex. It's part of God's creation. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So this is what we refer to as the cultural mandate. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. God intends us then, He gave us the primary environment, but His intention is for us to create things out of it and make something useful for society. It's what a carpenter does. He takes wood, the primary environment, fashions it into something which can be useful for a human being. Okay? So, incidentally, by the way, the cultural mandate is not something that has been abolished on account of sin coming into the world. You know, this might have been said in Genesis chapter 1 and then Genesis chapter 3, we have the sin and corruption. But guess what? In Genesis chapter 9, after God has flooded the earth and saved Noah and his family, and they come back down to the earth, God repeats this to Noah and his children. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. So the cultural mandate hasn't been abolished on account of the fall. God still wants us to go and create things and make things out of the primary environment into something that's beautiful, majestic, awesome to behold, creative. Right? So are we Christians against culture? We shouldn't be. Historically speaking, have we been? Absolutely. Have we burned books? Have we imprisoned Galileo? Have we done horrible things in the world? Absolutely. Because this is a complicated question. It's an enduring problem. And we haven't always answered the question well. So, here are, and we're going to close out with this and then go into Q&A, the 5 typologies that Niebuhr uses to describe how Christians have engaged with this enduring problem. Okay? So the first one, we'll kind of look at it this way. Let's say this is Christ and the C is culture. And in this first typology, it's Christ against culture. There is no point of contact between Christianity and culture. Therefore, we should avoid it altogether. Has nothing to do with us. That's one of the answers that certain Christian communities through the centuries have had. No contact, no point of interaction. Culture is corrupted, it's wicked, it's evil. We don't participate in it. So some of the examples you can think of are like the monastic movement, where they retreat from the world and go live out in the desert in their own little monastic communities because they want no point of contact with the world. So Christ against culture is the first of the typologies that Niebuhr presents. Please withhold judgment until the end of the class. Just look at them, soak in the information as much as you can. Second answer to this looks something more like this. Let's say this is Christ, and let's say this is culture. So Niebuhr refers to this typology as the Christ of culture. So it's almost like the exact opposite of the first typology, right? The first one was Christ against culture. This one's the Christ of culture. Have you ever met those Christians who you've lived with them for a while, you get to know them, and they seem to be religious folks, but there's absolutely no difference between them and a secular person. And thoroughly enculturated person. This is, normally speaking, the Christ of culture person. Accepts everything that there is in the culture out there and just incorporates it into their Christianity. One of the most controversial examples, of course, is abortion. There's hardly any difference in American Christianity in its statistics about who supports abortion or not with the secular world. It's become the Christ of culture. Whatever the culture tells us is right or wrong, hey, I'm totally with that. So they just soak in and imbibe the culture at the same time. Okay? So that's the second one, the Christ of culture. Two answers, Christ against culture, Christ of culture. We have three more to go. And these are the ones that we can refer to as the median types. And the reason why they are called the median types is because there will be some interface between Christ and culture. Not fully like Christ of culture, or not completely apart like Christ against culture. There will be some form of mediation between Christ and culture in these. The first one we'll look at of the median types is the Christ above culture typology. How does this look? Something like this. If this is Christ, the culture is below it, but did you notice that there is some overlap between Christ and culture there? So Christ is there, but the culture is there, but there is some overlap in between. This is basically the Catholic model of how to interact with the secular world, because Catholicism is very highly hierarchical. Everything is structured this way. It's a hierarchy. You know, even the priesthood, you go from the lowly guy all the way up to the Pope, right? Or when they characterize sins, it's always a hierarchy of sins, considering sexual sins, you know. The least menial of the sexual sins is thinking about it. And then you can go progressively worse and worse and worse to some horrible, heinous kinds of sins. So everything is in hierarchies in Catholic theology. So this is the first of the median types, Christ above culture. Second of the median types is the Christ and culture in paradox. And it will look something like this then. Christ, culture, and interface between the two, like that. This is basically Martin Luther. And for Martin Luther, it means that this is an unresolved tension. Living in the world, you won't be able to resolve it ever. So might as well just live in it. And that's why one of Martin Luther's most controversial statements is this: if you're going to sin, sin greatly. And people didn't understand what he was talking about. But it's this concept of, I can't escape the world. I can't escape the culture. I'm always going to have this tension between my Christian worldview and the culture that I live in, and it's not going to resolve ever. So I'm just going to have to make do. It's a paradox, and I can't do anything about it. I just have to live in it. That's why he could drink a whole lot of beer and enjoy the culture at the same time as he understood that it was not always going to be pleasing to God. So that's kind of like the Lutheran perspective. And the final typology we're going to look at, again, this is one of the median types, which has some interface between the two, is this one. Christ transforming culture. Christ transforming culture. And it'll look somewhat similar to the Lutheran type. Again, this way, with some interface between the two. But the major difference between this type and the Lutheran type is that for Luther, it was an unresolvable conflict. That'll never, ever, it's always going to be that way. But for this one, it's the Christian influence into the secular culture will help transform it, make it better. And there can be some historical precedent to that. One of the reasons why, as many historians will tell you, that Western civilization is the great civilization that it is on account of Judeo-Christian values and heritage. It made this culture, and especially its concepts of morality, of what's right and wrong, very, very important and key to developing the kind of advanced civilization that we have. Christianity transformed Rome from the pagan, hedonistic, tolerant civilization that it was into a moral civilization. Christ transforms the culture. So anytime, one of the illustrations that I can give is when Christian missionaries go to developing countries, there's a lot of criticism about that from the secular world because that's the pushback from the culture. But historically speaking, when Christian influence goes into a particular world, the culture gets better. Jobs, health, education. Because what do Christians do when they go to places like that? They create jobs, they give education, they teach people to read and write and math. They educate them, and they participate in the economy and help it to thrive. That happens over and over again. Yes, I know that doesn't mean that Christians have always, in their missionary endeavors, done good things to other cultures. But generally speaking, and a good historian with his or her salt will tell you that Christian influence in pagan societies, like it did to Rome or to Britain when there were horrible people in Britain, right? And Christianity came in, and St. Patrick came and got rid of all the snakes in Ireland, and all of these mythologies that we have about Christianity coming and having this good, positive influence on the culture. So that's what this fifth and last typology kind of looks like. So that's the difference between, it looks almost the same as the Lutheran, right? But for Luther, it would never be resolved. Whereas for this one, which is, let's say, the Protestant Reformed view of Christ transforming culture, there's something very positive about it. Do you see the positiveness of that? Christ transforming culture, teaching morality, ethics, doing good, loving people, caring for each other. Christ transforms the culture. Whereas for Luther, it's, might as well drink a beer and die. You see those? So, just to close out this first lecture series, introductory material over all of this, here are the 5 typologies for you. The Christ and culture one, where there's no point of contact between the two, and it's usually those Christian communities that have separated themselves from the world entirely because the world is so corrupt and wicked and evil. We'll go into the desert and create our monasteries because we don't want to participate in the culture at large. Mennonites, Quakers, Americans. We don't like Europe. We don't like those Brits. We're going to go out of this culture. It's desperately, wickedly corrupt, and go and find our promised land. That was the vision, the dream. Christ against culture. The Christ of culture. Incidentally, just to say about these two, usually the Christ against culture paradigm occurs when there is severe persecution of Christianity. Because when the culture at large is persecuting you, putting you to death, you tend to retreat from it. And the other one, the Christ of culture, where there's hardly any significant difference between the culture and your Christian faith, usually occurs when Christians are very lax and happy and profitable and doing well. Life is good. You tend to accept everything in the culture then. Persecuted, break out. Oh, I'm doing well. Culture must be good. Christ of culture. And then we have the three median types at the bottom. The Christ above culture, which will be the Catholic, hierarchical, everything in structures and hierarchies. And then the Christ and culture in paradox. Yes, there is always going to be mediatory, where you have to deal with this, but forget it. And the paradox is never going to be resolved. I might as well just live in the culture and enjoy it. Drink a beer, listen to my rock and roll, drive my Harley down the road, and hey, yeah, I'm living. And then the Christ transforming culture, which is the one where Christ comes, when Christ comes and influences the world for the better. Are you getting these five typologies now? They are different answers that different Christian communities throughout the centuries, from its very beginning, from its very inception, have given. And these answers are not compatible with each other, by the way. But none of them has the whole full picture. None of them is Christ, the historical figure. But our interpretations of the things that Christ taught cause us to have these differences in the world. And so that was Niebuhr's answer to the criticisms in the mid-20th century about why the criticism of Christians not being able to influence the culture for the better. Well, it's because Christians are confused. We're a confused bunch of people. We don't know how to do this well. And so these are the different models that we look at from the different Christian perspectives. Is this a good enough answer for you? Maybe not, but this is the reality of the situation of how to live in the world. And you're going to have to decide, if you're going to be a follower of Christ, which one of these models suits you. But I hope that you don't make that decision until you've gone through this course towards the end, collected as much of this information as possible, so that you can make a wise and informed decision. Right? And so at this point, I'm just going to close out my lecture. Thank you very, very much for coming here and listening patiently. I hope that it was very informative, that it helped you in your own Christian walk or non-Christian walk even. If you're part of the regular culture and you're trying to understand this thing, this is valuable information also. It'll help you to understand why the various different Christian groups react. Why a Christian baker decides that on my religious grounds, I cannot bake this cake. It'll help you understand why these things happen. Non-judgmentalism to begin with. Let's just look at the things first that way, right? Thank you very much for coming today. Appreciate it. And at this point, I guess I can just go ahead and open the floor up to some questions or discussion that we can share and dialogue about. What I'd like to say is, since I'm recording the audio, if you do have a question, I'd like you to come up over this way and just speak it up into the microphone, which I think is on.
You were talking earlier about the difference in Korea and Japan. And do you know what percent of Japan has accepted the Christianity?
Yeah.
Compared to Korea?
That is a very, very good question. Last I heard statistically, and we're talking about recent, statistically, it's Christianity in Japan is about 4% or less than 4%. That's small.
That is very small.
And then Christianity in Korea, in South Korea, is about 38%. It's still a minority, but it's hugely more significant than in Japan. Yeah.
Right.
But interestingly enough, when we're talking about the country of Korea, it's about maybe 38% of the people there are Christian. That's huge. In one generation we're talking about, right? But for migrant Koreans, that is Koreans that don't live on the peninsula, but migrated to, let's say, Brazil or United States, wherever they've gone to other parts of the world, Christianity among the migrant Korean population is about 80%. So just the thing of them going out of their own setting and going into a foreign land tends for them to maybe syncretize into the Western Christian religion a lot easier. So just in America, for example, the largest growing churches in America are Korean churches. There are about 4,000 of them now, just in America. Of course, the majority of them are small little dinky things here and there, spread out throughout the states wherever Christians have gone and formed communities.
Speaking of that, how many? Do you know the percentage of? Do
No.
you know the percentage of, say, the Korean people?
Uh-huh.
How many just go into a church that is like this one, or St. James, and decide not to just worship with my own, but I'm going to.
Worship outside of my own group of people.
Well, yeah, but once you come here and you become an American, you're an American. That's
Yeah.
how I feel. And I mean, that's okay to do that, if you want to, as long as you worship and as long as you're all inclusive.
Okay.
We've been through all that.
Yes.
But I was just wondering how many people from, say, the Korean culture, it could be the Japanese culture, any culture,
Yeah.
decide to just go out and join their neighborhood church. If you get what
Let's look at the context of American Christianity. Okay?
Okay.
Because, there's this great mythology around America and its religion. Whereas we forget about all sorts of things in history, but there is this kind of prevailing notion that America is a Christian nation, right? Because we think we have this great mythology of the Pilgrims and the Puritans and all of the religious communities coming to America and forming this country, irrespective of the fact that hundreds of years prior to all of that, they had already come here to exploit the land and make a fortune and enslave people and do all kinds of atrocities to the land prior to all of that. But so there's all of this complicated history. America is a complicated place. But so they came over, and there were communities of largely Christ against culture type people that came to America at first because they were persecuted in their own lands. In England, they went to Amsterdam, they were persecuted there, decided we need to go somewhere totally, completely out of this world. And that's what America became to them. It became the promised land. So they came here with this paradigm, this typology of Christ against culture. And one of the healthy things that came out of this paradigm is because the governments in these old cultures where we lived persecuted us, let's limit the power of the government. You see, all of this stuff plays even into the politics of a group of people. And so America has this long-standing tradition of separation of state, church and state, not because they wanted the state to impose its control over the church, but the opposite way. They didn't want the state to control the church. Think about where they came from. Great Britain, state-run church. Germany, state church. All the European countries have a state church. They came to America to escape the persecution of the state-run religion. And the way they did it is to separate the church and the state. Basically, the original intent was to say, government, you can't tell us how to worship. You can't. It's not your sphere. Stay out of our houses of worship. That's what the separation of church and state originally was. It's, of course, been flipped around nowadays because people are so misinformed about history to think it means that the church is, the government can tell the church not to do things. But that's not what the original intent of it was for. So they came here seeking religious freedom from religious persecution with this model, this typology of the culture is against us. Came here and settled and created this incredible culture, this incredible country. Did it have its faults? Absolutely. Huge, tremendous faults. But the advancement of modernity and civilization, the project of culture in this country has been nothing short of tremendous and exponentially tremendous. I'm not talking about just little leaps and bounds. I mean, this country is only 300 years old, which means It's a blip in the history of human civilization. But in America, it's been an exponential growth in civilization. So we have imbibed an incredibly wonderful system of culture in this place. And one of the principles that, as we saw, taken from the Romans, is the principle of tolerance. We're going to tolerate everybody, all religions, all backgrounds, all places. How that played out in American society, just as it did in Roman society, where people preach, quote unquote, tolerance, is you can see that certain people, they can actually be very radically intolerant. That's the history of the South in America, of people who are different from them, right? So this kind of difficult climate, into this difficult climate comes ethnic groups and populations from all over the world, at first from Europe, and then Eastern Europe. It got open to those Poles. We still joke about those Poles, don't we? We didn't like them when they came over here at first. Or those Irish, and people like that when they first started coming into this country. But with them, these ethnic populations, and this is consistent through the history of America, is they would come here and they would build their own churches. So it is nothing new that when these Asians finally got access to immigration into this country, back in the 60s with the civil rights movement, because prior to that they couldn't come here, except the Chinese for forced labor to build the railroads, although they weren't granted citizenship or right to vote or anything of that sort until the 60s. Right? So the Chinese were here for centuries, but they were basically considered illegals. Even if they had children that were born here, or even if they intermarried into the population here, their children were not allowed the regular rights of citizens and so forth. So these tiny pockets of ethnic communities would come to this country. They would be derided by the mainstream population, the Irish, the Poles. What would they do? They would build their own churches. That's consistent. So now that we got Asians coming in, what do the Asians do? They build their own churches. The Korean American church. But prior to that, it was the Polish American church or the Irish American church. The Irish are Catholics, and they would build a Catholic church here, and the Protestants would build the Protestant church there. And they would throw rocks at each other across the fence, right? They did that in America too, because they're bringing their cultural baggage into America. And so Asians, when they finally allowed legal migration to this country, they brought their cultural baggage into America too and created their own cultures too. This is what generally happens. The normal pattern is this. It takes about 2 to 3 generations for these ethnic groups to integrate into the society. And so the Irish, they had children here. That group would become more integrated, and then their children would be fully integrated into American society. Same with the Poles, the Eastern Europeans, the Czechoslovakians, the Serbians, and all of those people escaping persecution. A lot of people came to this country escaping persecution. Come here, they create their first enclave, their ghettos, they would be called ghettos, and their own churches within that ghettos, but then the next generation integrates deeper into mainstream America, and by the 3rd or 4th generation, they're fully integrated. That's why we have mutts like you all in this culture, because you're all fully integrated Americans now, right? Here's the problem. And this is something that sociologists struggle with in universities. The Europeans and the Eastern Europeans, it was much more easier, let's put it that way, for them to integrate by the 2nd, 3rd generation into American culture, because guess what? They look the same. They look white. But now that you start getting immigrants from Asia, from Africa, they look different, right? I don't look like a mainstream white American guy. I look very different. So these populations that physically, we're talking physically, look different from the mainstream American culture have a more difficult time integrating into the American culture. So That's the problem that sociologists are wrestling with right now. And now, not just Asians, but now Middle Easterners who bring with them their own cultural baggage of Islam coming into America now. How do you integrate those people in here? That's a huge, huge problem. And something that we're going to have to try to figure out some kind of solution to it. But going back to the question of the churches then, the Korean American churches, here's the thing that's been happening recently. In the last 10 years, prior to that 60s when Asian migration was first opened up, tons of Koreans migrated to America. And usually it was the cream of the crop. The doctors, the lawyers, the nurses, the working professionals, those people who had access to migration to America. But they came, in their country, in South Korea, they were looked up and respected. Oh, this person, he's a doctor. They come to America, what do? They can't work as a doctor, they run dry cleaners. They start at the bottom of the ladder, like every immigrant population has had to do. The Poles, the Irish, they all had to start at the bottom. And they lose their respectability, that respectability they had back in their home country. Oh, people looked up to me. I was a doctor there. Now I'm cleaning other people's clothes. I'm dry cleaning stuff. Where do they get their sense of identity and respect? They get it in their ethnic church. When they go there, I'm still Dr. Kim within my little ethnic enclave. They know me as that. They respect me. And that's why these populations tend to do that. They have little potholes of culture. Los Angeles, where I came from for 30 years, I lived there in 30 years. They used to call it the melting pot because there's so many groups from all over the world coming together, and they thought it would be a good and glorious experiment of multiculturalism. It didn't work. Why? Because they self-segregated. Interesting. The blacks, they live in the black area. The Armenians, they live in the Armenian area. We do that. Why? It's a very, very complicated, insightful, brilliant question, which is an enduring problem for which I really don't have a good answer. I wish I did. But I've been struggling with this, and someday I'm going to write a book about this. God willing. I call it cultural captivity. Can we break away from it? Are we enslaved to our culture? So much so to the point that we can't get out and experience other people or other things. Right? Are we captive to the culture that we were born in? And if so, what can we do to experience people from different places and cultures and backgrounds in a good, healthy, positive way? That's something that I'm going to be wrestling with for probably my entire lifetime. Hopefully I'll get the book finished someday. But sorry I couldn't fully answer your question, but I hope it gives us some insight as to why minority ethnic groups tend to self-segregate into their own churches. Mm-hmm. Yes. Uh-huh. Incidentally, now we're getting into the second and third generation of Asian immigrants into this country, and there has actually been a thesis written by a Korean lady who is a brilliant lady, and she calls it the silent exodus. Because what has been happening in all of these first generation Korean churches is the second generation and the third generation have been going, I'm going to get out of this place. They're integrating into American society. They can't fully integrate because you and me look different, right? But they're escaping their first cultural captivity, and they call it the silent exodus. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? That's up to people to decide. Some people don't like it, some people love it. Right? But, yeah. But that's why a lot of Korean churches and a lot of any ethnic church, the Polish church, by the second and third generation, those buildings become empty. And everybody's wondering, we're a bunch of old folks. Where did everybody go? Part of it is cultural captivity. Brilliant question. Thank you so much, friend.
I can maybe work this into a question. It's starting it, and I'm concerned about the cultural thing and what identifies us, and it's our relationship and our identity, and that's where we find comfort. And you just blew me away when you talked about this cultural, which I guess at this point we would call global. I have a hard time identifying myself there.
Yeah.
But as a white American male, I have a relationship with something, you know, or as a member of the baseball team, I have a relationship there. And, you know, politicians and other people keep trying to make us members of a global community. And, you know, how am I going to get my badge? I don't know. You know, I don't know what I'm going to be when I get there. I'm really excited to get to session 7 and 8 because I think you said the answer's there.
Yes.
I don't know how it's going to happen.
Thank you, Ed. As you can see, this is a persistent, enduring problem, right? Culture. Culture is a difficult, very, very difficult thing for us to address. What I think Ed was talking about is this idea of a global community that a lot of the liberal side of the political spectrum keep pushing and harping about. And this is the difficulty with that. And I think a lot of even the sociologists who tend to be on the liberal side of the equation have discovered that it's problematic. It's like the idea that happened in Los Angeles of the cultural boiling pot. And then they discovered that it doesn't work, that people tend to self-segregate themselves by people who are alike. Oh, this person looks like me. If I'm going to hang out with this person, that person don't look like me, or don't speak like me, or don't eat the kind of foods I eat, I'm going to avoid them. This idea of self-segregation. You find this microcosm in the high school cafeteria. The jocks hang out with the jocks and the cheerleaders with the cheerleaders, and you all remember that, right? You all hung out with people who are like you. Is this a bad thing or is this a good thing? And is this project of trying to create one big global community even feasible? It's very difficult. I think it's wrong. I don't think it's ever going to happen. Because like you were saying, Ed, we are enculturated beings. We exist within a certain pocket of community. I'm Korean. That's part of my culture. That's part of my makeup. But even within that, I'm a distinctly different kind of Korean than a lot of other Koreans are, because I can't even speak the Korean language that well. I'm an immigrant Korean who lived in Uganda and grew up in Brazil. I'm a rare breed. We all are. So if you break down community by all sorts of types and things, you ultimately end out with the individual. And each individual is unique and different in their own regard. You will never find the same Ed out there. Oh, hi, Ed. You know, but you will find people with whom you share many, many commonalities. And those are the people that you tend to hang out with. Is that wrong? No. We can't place a judgment on self-segregation, although we try to do that, but we cannot judge that. What we can do, however, is encourage people to take a few steps out of their own cultural captivity and go hang out with Pastor James or somebody who's a little bit different from you and experience something a little bit different. Go watch a foreign movie, or go eat a foreign food, or go try some pad thai, or do something which is a little bit different. Maybe eat a live octopus someday. No, don't do that, okay? But you know, there's so many different kinds of things, and so just to experiment, your base will be there. You will always be African American with your long history that informs the person that you have become, and that's beautiful. It's not something that you don't want to take away by trying to create this global community. No, I want your radical distinctness in there for each and every single one of you. So that's why I say that global project, it's doomed to failure. And people who were thinking about that back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the sociologists nowadays look at it and go, the cultural melting pot never melted, and it never will. Will there be some interface and integration? Absolutely. But you need to keep your own uniqueness and distinctiveness. One more thing I will say about that, if that's okay, is we actually take this from Christianity and its idea of who God is. What's the Christian God? A Trinity, right? Father, Son, Holy Spirit. There's this unity in the Christian God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, all one God. But there's also diversity. They're unique to each other, right? Unity and diversity in the Trinity. The Son is not the Father. The Father is not the Son. Son is not the Holy Spirit. Father is not the Holy Spirit, so forth. They are one, but they're diverse. And so my answer, taken from a Christian theological perspective to the problem of culture and ethnic groups and individual identity, is you actually need both. You need your individual uniqueness as a person situated within a larger community. It's complicated, but that tension will always be there. Because you can't just be an individual on an island all by yourself. You were created to be in relationship. And this is the perfect model of what relationship looks like. The perfect one, out of which humans have been created for relationship. God created them male and female, implying He wants them to model that perfect relationship by creating them as relational beings. So, in those relationships, all sorts of messes happen. I mean, look at your marriages, right? But that's the unity in diversity, which is much more complex than just looking at it as we just want to find a great big global unity. Or we're just going to be isolated, diverse individuals separated from each other. Ain't going to work either extreme. So we need to figure out this model based off of out of the Christian Trinitarian conception of God, of what it means to be a tribe and an individual within that tribe.
Well, my question was more about the tolerance, because we do have so much of difference of opinions within our own Christianity of how much tolerance we should have for others who are maybe against our beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
I think you kind of just helped me there with that last description, saying that yes, we have to have unity, but diversity. My question was, how tolerant should we be as Christians for those things that go against our beliefs?
Fantastic.
Yeah. But I do think that helped me in describing the Trinity, that we have to have unity as people and love for each other, but yet we have to have diversity and realize that we are diverse and different from maybe other people who don't have our same beliefs.
Thank you. This is wonderful, wonderful questions. You guys can run this class. I'm just going to head out the door. This is fantastic. Thank you for that question. We talked a little bit about tolerance today, right? And we actually saw that tolerance is a pagan virtue, right? The Romans were tolerant. They would tolerate other people to a certain extent. Tolerance is a pagan virtue. Whereas for the Christian, the higher virtue is not tolerance. You don't just merely tolerate somebody who's different from you. The Christian virtue is love. Jesus said, what good is it if you love those who are same as you? Why do you only hang out with people just like you? I say to you, if you're going to be my follower, love your enemy. How are you going to do that? Supposing your enemy is a Muslim. Supposing your enemy is a Buddhist. Supposing your enemy, like you were talking about, even within the Christian family, there's a lot of infighting. Supposing you're Protestant Irish and your neighbor is a Catholic Irish. Right? Do you merely tolerate them? Paganism? No, we are called, the Christians are actually called to a much higher standard, which is love. And that's what you're supposed to do with people who are different from you. Can you love the Muslim? Can you love the Catholic? Or the Greek Orthodox? Or the Southern Baptist? You know, oftentimes I hear y'all here in Florida have a lot of cheeky things to say about them Southern Baptists or whoever else, right? So, my answer to that is the answer that Jesus would give. We are called to a higher virtue than merely to tolerate them. And I think that's what Heather was talking about earlier on when she had a question about that, about the call to love rather than just to tolerate people and things, right? So it all comes down to that. And how we practice that, can it be done? Absolutely it can be done. But it can not be done, and this is the way I'll put it, outside of Christ. You will never love somebody who's different than you outside of Christ. Only in Christ will you be able to love somebody so radically that it'll transform not just them, but you. And that's what love will do. So that's the virtue we're called to, the higher virtue. Jesus said it this way when he was asked, what's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then the smart, cheeky little young rabbi said, but who's my neighbor? And that's when Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan. The hated person, the enemy of the Jew, the one who was different, the other. But what was the Samaritan? He was the hero in that story, right? And then he told the young guy who came to him and asked him that question. Well, let me tell you, who loved? Was it the priest who walked away, the rabbi who walked away on the other side of the road? Or was it the Good Samaritan who stopped and helped that person in a time of need? And even took them to the inn and bathed them and clothed them and did all of that stuff. And the answer is obvious. Jesus' parables are very obvious, right? It's the person who does something for the other, who loves them. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I don't even know what time it is. Do we kind of get past all of that? Oh, 12 o'clock. Okay, so thank you very much for coming to today's lecture. I could tell that it was very insightful to you all. Please do come back next Sunday because this was just an introduction. Next Sunday we're going to look at the first typology, that of Christ against culture, which incidentally America was first founded through that kind of typology also. And then we'll go through all of the different typologies. So please do come back. Thank you. We have some food and snacks. Please enjoy those now. Appreciate it.